I'll start with the land acknowledgement. I am on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Grand River, and their Haldeman Tract, as well as the overlapping territory, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and historically, if you go back far enough, the Neutral Nations as well. It's a gray day here on the territory, but I'm always grateful to be here. And Yeah, I work with an Anishinaabe elder that you all know, Peter Schuler, and I'm on his territory here. His wife is Haudenosaunee, so hopefully that land acknowledgement keeps the peace at their house or something. Yeah.
So I'm speaking from the Musqueam Reserve, which is adjacent to the University of British Columbia, and both the university is located on unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam people, and I'm living on Musqueam land. I'm very grateful to be here as well, and to be nurtured by all the by the land and by all the entities that live in this territory.
Mm.
I was a co-host of the Preparing for the End of the World as We Know It Peter Wall roundtable virtual sessions or virtual roundtable sessions. This is the last session. For the first session, I was going to present with Dan McCarthy about the implications for education and social innovation. But what ended up happening was that I presented an exercise that took up the whole session. So Dan kindly suggested that he could record a reflection on the sessions based on the presentation he was going to do on the first session that we had. So today he's going to be presenting what he was going to present on the first session, plus the reflections that he has had, having been through all the 6 sessions that we had together. So Dan, over to you.
Well, thanks, Vanessa. It's been a real privilege working with you and attending all of these sessions, and it was a very easy decision to defer this talk given the nature of the first session, which was really profound. I was really deeply affected by it. So I appreciate people's patience if they were expecting a presentation from me, because I think selfishly it was a really good call to continue the discussion in the way that we were continuing it. What I was going to do was talk a little bit about social innovation and thinking about some of its own biases, some of its limitations in relation to this work, and and then some tools of innovation, social innovation as well, that we have been developing through the work with people like Francis Wesley and the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience, but many of our partner organizations as well. I now have the privilege, though, of having gone through all of these sessions and being a part of them and taking copious notes, which I was sort of skimming through prior to this call. They were all such rich discussions that I'm both feel like this is a privilege, but also a daunting task to in some ways summarize it. But I don't think that's really the intent. We talked about social innovation throughout the sessions, and I think one of the big things for me that I want to highlight here is I was coming into these sessions thinking about social innovation as a discipline, as a practice, and thinking about how this work feeds into the kind of system change that we need in order to in some ways prevent the end of the world as we know it. Of course, thinking about how to deal with the impacts of climate change and racial inequalities of all kinds, and all kinds of inequalities and oppression and marginalization, violence. Everything that we're seeing, today in our world, and a lot of the work that I've been doing around innovation and systems change and using systems and complexity ideas has been about preventing that change. And I think one of the things that I've come to realize is there are going to be changes that we cannot prevent, and that we need to be prepared and have the capacity and the resilience to be able to deal with loss, change, uncertainty. And in fact, the biggest piece there, I think, is uncertainty. And that's some of what I was getting out of these sessions, and some of the reading I've been doing lately is being able to sit with discomfort in that sort of negative capability, negative education kind of way is incredibly important. And I think in the work that we've done around social innovation, we've talked about the kinds of tools that are really necessary. And people like Francis and others have been absolutely brilliant in articulating the kinds of conceptual tools and practical tools that are really important to be able to help change makers to see a system and to intervene in it more effectively. And Francis is among all kinds of people around the world really trying to do this work, and it's been going on for a long time. There's been a lot of people that have been looking at the use of systems and complexity tools for thinking about systems change. And you can think about Donella Meadows and Peter Senge and many others in that regard, and long before then people like Stafford Beer. And all of these people thinking about how do we use complexity tools to help us to better understand and intervene effectively in complex systems. Some of that work is about introducing in many ways a different ontology, a different way of approaching problems. But only, I think, fairly recently, there's been a group of people that have really been pushing for the use of and the need for sort of approaching the complexity in here so that we can see the complexity out there. My first introduction to it was through the work of Julian Norris, who's a colleague, and I met him through work at the BAM Center that we were doing on social innovation and the importance of and the integration of depth work in order to be able to see our own sort of biases, assumptions, and be able to shed them in a way that we can see new opportunities in the system and more effectively intervene in the system. I think that was, for me, a huge first step in realizing that the kind of training that we've been offering in social innovation and the way that we've been approaching it was in many ways missing that. Now, there's all kinds of people that have been writing on this, Otto Scharmer, Peter Senge, David Peter Stroh, and Michelle Lee Moore and Francis Wesley and Perils, and all kinds of people that are thinking about the role of sort of scaling deep along with the scaling up and out, the need for that inner work. But I think that what this set of sessions and what Vanessa's work has been doing, and there are other people like Melanie Goodchild, for instance, that are doing work that is in many ways parallel to this. This is important work to help us to push ideas around social innovation to another level in a way. When we first started talking about this and first started thinking about some of the disciplinary challenges associated with social innovation, we were thinking about the fact that it was really focused in many ways on simplistic solutions when problems are more usefully thought of as complex, that we often, in the way that many people think about the distinctions between simple, complicated, and complex. People like Ralph Stacey and many others that make those distinctions, Brenda Zimmerman. Those distinctions really useful. And I think that was a really useful sort of breakthrough in a way to be able to say we are often approaching these problems in either a simple or complicated way, and not really pushing our thinking into what does it mean to tackle a complex or even a chaotic system. And I think that it's a real challenge to be able to get people to start doing that. And in many ways, that has less to do with the system and more to do with our own biases and assumptions and propensities and our own foibles, really. I mean, we hope that things are simple. Another sort of barrier, in a lot of the social innovation work is that it is very, and again, I think it's the way in which, and the people that have been involved in the development of it, very ethnocentric and Eurocentric and anthropocentric. Social innovation is intended to fix modernity for those that created it, and as people like Elder Peter Schuler, who's been part of this journey, always point out that it's not just people, let alone, white, uh, in a lot of cases, male, cisgendered, heterosexual people that are involved in these kinds of processes. We haven't had the tools, we haven't broadened the thinking, we haven't pushed ourselves to do the work that is necessary. And I think only through these kinds of processes can that be done. There is the way that social innovations have been funded, and it is often itself tied to modernity, and we don't think about challenging modernity. And in that way, it can be very paternalistic to various marginalized people. And again, these are all pieces that we had thought of ahead of time, but I think were really just reinforced by a lot of the thinking and the discussions as we went through. And the last one is this notion of bounded rationality. I think that one of the biggest, most useful tools that I found is this from systems thinking, for thinking about systems change, is that we often assume a set of boundaries, spatial, temporal, conceptual boundaries that allow us to see certain things and in a way simplify the complexity around us. But then we forget that they're just tools. We forget that they're just heuristics or conceptual tools. And we forget they're there. And we assume that that is the boundary of the system. And in fact, if we think about that, and we think about that as an entry point, and think about the way that we think about systems and the biases and privilege and the traumas that we carry, those are our boundaries. And so we then, the challenge is to be able to dig into those. And I think that throughout these sessions, each week in many ways, we were presented with a sort of a stimulus. And our challenge, in the way that you said it, Vanessa, I think, was to respond to that challenge and to say, okay, to sit in the uncertainty, to do that head-heart experiment. And I kept thinking to myself, it was a form of sort of exposure therapy for those, that have had some kind of phobia. Oftentimes, one of the approaches is this idea of exposure therapy, where you're exposed in a safe way to what it is that you're afraid of. And I think that that's one way to start building that resilience, building that negative capability to help us then to deal with some of these challenges associated with sort of the discipline or practice of social innovation. And that was when, through the sessions, I was thinking to myself, okay, this is clearly an incredibly important piece to thinking about systems change, innovation, system transformation, transition management, however you want to frame it. This is clearly, I think, I had in here other pieces, thinking about some of the tools that we use, some of these distinctions between simple, complicated, complex, distinction between entropic chaos, deterministic chaos. Entropic chaos being when chaos, when a system reaches a state whereby there is no gradients to dissipate anymore, there is no patterns that will reemerge. Where deterministic chaos is where patterns emerge and reemerge, and you have this sort of flipping back and forth in sort of patterns and structures emerging and not. That's a useful distinction. Some of these things, the false versus genuine paradoxes, oftentimes we like to make distinctions and say it's either this or this and you can't have both. And then there are tools like Three Horizons framework and this idea of negative capability that I really think that the piece about building the capacity, the negative capability, the negative education to do the work where you sit in the complexity and the uncertainty in the way that these sessions allowed us to do each week. And that is really one of the, I would say it's got to be one of the most central capacities in order to deal with systems change. And it has fundamentally shifted my thinking in social innovation away from, as this pointed to, fixing, and then as our discussions pointed to, fixing modernity in a way, to be able to say, okay, you know what? It's okay if we can't fix it. It's okay, and we can build the capacity to sit in that uncertainty. That I think, but that is incredibly difficult to explain to a funder, or I think it is becoming more explicit, more tangible for people. I think it's becoming easier to explain to, for instance, a funder, but it's still really difficult for a lot of people to get their hands around. And in part, I think it's because when you think about system transformation. When you think about the kind of change that is needed, we do suffer from this idea of bounded rationality, where we have, in decision making, rationality of individuals is limited by the information they have and the cognitive limitations on their mind and the finite amount of time they have to make a decision. Or people make quite reasonable decisions based on the information they have, but they don't have perfect information, especially about distant parts of the system. I think that this piece, this building negative capability, while it is becoming, something that can be more expressed more clearly now, is something that we're going to struggle with convincing everyone for the need of. I think that it is something that some people are going to get right away. And some people are going to finally be like, oh, thank goodness, we finally put that piece of the moving puzzle, as Vanessa said it earlier, into the puzzle. But there are many people who won't see it even as a puzzle piece. There are many people for whom, because of their privilege, their biases, their traumas, their just their psyche, that they won't be able to see it even as a piece of the puzzle. Or if they do, it'll be some kind of not an explicit requirement for thinking about systems change. And I think that this is going to be the challenge of this work, is being able to push the thinking with the people that realize that it is necessary, and to continue to do these sort of transformative learning experiments where people make breakthroughs and do the kind of negative education, the peeling back of the onion that is necessary, and then to be able to change the people in the institutions that are in many ways, and understandably so, stuck in places that they can't get out of and can't even see the need for this. That's going to be the challenge. And for me, before this work, before I started understanding sort of the importance of this, I don't think you could have explained that to me. And I wouldn't have seen it as such an important piece, an essential piece in thinking about systems change or innovation. Now I can't think about innovation without thinking about this piece, and how to raise the consciousness of the whole system in a way to help people to build that capacity. And maybe like herd immunity, there's only a small percentage of people that we need to do this work, and they'll be able to help the system along, and build that capacity that is necessary to help us navigate those highly uncertain times. I think about those sort of fitness landscapes that complexity thinkers often think about, whereby we are on a sort of a point of fitness within the landscape from evolutionary biology. But in order to get to a higher point, we often have to go down through a trough. We have to go down through a very stable, in some ways, state that we can get stuck in order to be able to navigate up to a higher point. That's not necessarily intuitive, and that's one of the values of thinking about these ideas, from a complexity point of view, is in order to make it to that higher state, we have to go down through this mess. And people like Thomas Over Dixon have talked about these complexity landscapes, these fitness landscapes, energy landscapes, as sort of being under a bank of clouds. So we're on top of a point here that's highly unstable, and we have to go down through a clouded area in order to get to a higher point. But we need that negative capability to be able to say, I'm willing to go. I'm willing to go down into that cloud bank. And again, maybe we only need a few people. It's like the notion of herd immunity, that to get, to be able to get the system to be able to move down through there in an effective way. I don't know, but anyway, I think I'm glad I have the privilege, in a way, of sort of speaking to this after these sessions, because these sessions really brought home to me the importance of this particular piece. And I knew it before, but if we're talking about innovation or systems change, this is the piece that I think is the most critical, but also the most difficult to explain, the most difficult to sell to a funder, the most difficult to engage in. So will you get on that? Vanessa, please help us out.
Thank you, Dan. I think what you're saying about this being a very small piece of a bigger puzzle in terms of systems change, but it's if you think about systems change as a moving puzzle, right? And this being a very small piece, but if it's not there, things don't move,
Yeah.
right? And
we can end up reinforcing things, right?
Yeah.
This is the other piece, that if
It
we
gets in a loop.
don't realize that it's there and that it is so essential, that's when we make these kind of silly mistakes.
Yeah.
And we end up reinforcing systems which are the problem or part of the problem in the first place. And then we can't figure out why we're not having any traction in trying to make the system move into a different space or prevent something or being able to navigate, difficult or uncertain spaces. Sorry,
it becomes quite circular, right? And
yeah, absolutely.
And I think this is an interrupter of the circularity. Yeah. And that's why it has to invite people into that. I've been calling it depth. Because the problem with positive and negative is that people already have these categories loaded. Yeah. But although it works sometimes to talk about positive education versus negative education, but talking about depth, it goes into that valley that you're talking about. And it is about seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes. So how deeply we are colonized, for example, in our imagination, in our desire, in our thinking, in our relations, in our sensibilities, and not this kinds of conversations are not trying to solve it immediately. They're just trying to sit with what's in there. Yes. And probably solutions or experiments are found accidentally once you're sitting with these things and trying to expand your capacity to sit with difficult things without being overwhelmed or immobilized. Then something happens accidentally, and then you have an innovation that you couldn't have planned before, right? You couldn't have thought of it before. So it's beyond what's thinkable unless you go into that space. But that is a space of discomfort. So we've been talking about, after the sessions, with a few people interested in how to invite into depth conversations, how to explain depth conversations, how to articulate it for other people. It's always more useful to do it probably in relation to what already happened. So the kinds of conversations we have are generally conversations that are focused on getting things done. So they're kind of solutionist conversations, or they're focused on feeling better. They're more therapeutic conversations, or they're focused on placating anxiety. Some of these anxieties are chronic, so they're more kind of, I would say, neurotic conversations about just getting us to not get unhinged or unglued. But these conversations are depth conversations. They are not focused on either. They're not about solutions. They are not about therapy. They are not about placating anxieties. They're about actually facing things we don't want to see. So facing things that really challenge us to our core. And I think the sessions might have, and it's different things for different people. So some people probably might have got challenged by the fact that we had ceremonies while we were doing this. Others might have been challenged by, we did have people challenging the representation of bodies in it from one side and from another. Or people challenging, like we had one session which used tarot as a mode of engagement with possibilities rather than with predictions. It was not a predictive one. It was just, let's see what we can look at if we access different layers of things. So all kinds of things came up, questions of authenticity, questions of representation, but these are all things that are part of the bigger puzzle, and they have their place, and they're also misplaced and misrepresented, and it can become messy and toxic sometimes because we don't have the ability to hold space for it. I think, I don't know if it is about developing our capacity for holding space for more complexity. Maybe that's one way of talking about it. But if we don't have the capacity to hold space for our own complexity, there's no chance we can hold space for the complexity outside of us. and this complexity is exponentially increasing, right? Growing and expanding. So how are we going to work with system transformation without the ability or the capacity to hold space for things that are uncomfortable and uncertain and complex and plural and also contingent and paradoxical and contradictory? That is, I think, what this can do is develop that capacity, but it can't do more than that. We would need other spaces where we go back to, okay, so then from here, what else needs to get done? And once you start getting it done and face more complexity, how we go back to that space of capacity expansion, right? And referent expansion, where we learn to dig deeper and relate wider, perhaps.
And I think the one thing that some of the literature points to this, and your work points to this, is modernity as we know it, and part of the problem there is that is such a big sort of set of concepts and systems that it's so difficult for people to wrap their head around. Whenever I talk about modernity, I sort of talk to people that it's use the metaphor of like asking a fish about water. A fish can't describe water because it doesn't know what not water is, and we're in the same boat. And so part of our challenge is to be able to figure out just what modernity is and all of the influences that it has upon us. And even just I was reading Tyson Yonkaporta's book, Sand Talk, and he writes in there about public education and how it came from the Prussians, and that it was really designed in many ways to essentially domesticate us and to stretch out this idea of adolescence so that people become more pliable and would follow the need to march into battle and get slaughtered and I when I realized that, I was like, oh my God, like I'm contributing to and have been contributing to this system, and in ways that use the tools that Tyson Yonkaporta talks about, and I apologize if I'm butchering his last name, but that was really profound for me. And there are many ways to react to that. Thankfully, I was reading that book at a time when I'd been working with people like you and others that I'd already developed, some measure of, I think, some depth work that I'd been doing, where I sat with that and I thought, oh my goodness, like we have created all kinds of systems as part of modernity that, as you say, infantilize us, right? We want things, we want them now. We have the internet and our economic system, our education system, right? It all infantilizes us. And what we need to do is to help at least some people move into some kind of maturity, move stages of life, whatever, or move into eldership, so that there is at least someone in the room that can be sitting there going, people's inner toddlers are starting to spill out again because there was this misunderstanding, and some of the the cartographies that you and Elwood and Sharon articulate in this book speak to that. That's a landscape of possibilities where you have to have at least someone in the room that is slightly more mature. And I don't know if that's the most, I used to rail against some aspects of integral theory and developmental psychology, because apparently I was at the stage in sort of that development where I didn't like hierarchy. So of course I didn't like them. But, in some ways you can sit in a space now. I can now sit in a space. I'm at the beginning of this journey, but I can sit in a space and go, I just saw a shift in the nature of the discussion, because this person had an aspect of their inner toddler spill out, which led to a reaction from someone else. And the conversation which could have been really generative, has moved us far away from where we needed to be. And, if I was more effective as an intervener, as a whatever, convener, and I think that what these tools can do is allow someone to sit in a place like that, and to be able to gently and from a loving place to show what they're seeing, to be able to that's at a micro level, right? In terms of conversations. If we can start to embed that maturation process, the incentive to mature, the structures to, to do that work, the depth work, we're going to see, I think emergence at broader levels in institutions that will start to require this. Organizations, institutions, and then it'll move out into sort of, broader, sort of the ethos of the system, I hope. And I don't know where those thresholds are, but that is the hope in terms of the broader systems change, I think. And thinking about social innovation and thinking about the role of this thinking is that this itself, hopefully, is a social innovation that will start to take root. And I think part of it is this, you talk about it. We all need to compost our shit. We all need to do that difficult work of maturing and stepping in and through these sort of stages of life, or into elderhood, or becoming an adult in a way that we're not really called to do through aspects of modernity. But then the other side of that is there are all kinds of people that, for instance, don't have my privilege. I've been so protected by this system because of who I am and the body I inhabit, that I had the capacity to, and the space, and the wherewithal, the resources, the resilience to try and engage in this work. It is a privilege. There are other people that are forced into it in some ways, and that have then used it to heal. But there's all kinds of people that we can't force into this. And so ethically we can't do that because it raises traumas, or it's just, I don't think it's ethical for us to push people into transformative learning experiences, or to push them into that depth work. But I think if we model the behavior, and I think the other thing is if there's at least a couple of people in a room, or there's at least that perspective within an institution that there is a need for that maturation, and that there are incentives. I mean, think about an institution like a university. If there was actually an incentive as part of performance reviews for profs to do depth work, then that would be the institution maturing, right? And it would I think have profound effects at what the institution is capable of. And that's just universities. Universities are slow to change, so maybe we have to talk about companies in the private sector. I don't know. But I think that is really, at the heart of this, is that need to mature. We are, I am still an infant in the work that I need to do in terms of depth, and to do but I have the privilege to do it, and I've been called to do it. I suppose I have the privilege and the resources, resilience to do it. I feel very, really privileged in that. But I've also gone through a number of sort of transformative learning experiences where I've had some very patient teachers, and some not so patient, but those actually can push you even harder, which is wonderful. Where I've made mistakes, and I think that they're difficult, and they hurt. But then once you go through a few of them and you realize what you're then capable of in terms of going through it, but also what is on the other side, and then you realize that you can be a better, colleague, friend, ally, parent, brother, sister, teacher, researcher. At the end of it, you start to seek them out. I mean, and then there's the issue of it becoming an addiction, which you also have to worry about. Aversion or addiction, but somewhere in the middle, we need incentives to mature. We need incentives to do this work of composting our shit, to mature, to step into elderhood. And then once those people are in the room, I think we can have different conversations. But there's enormous work that needs to be done to get people like me, with all kinds of privilege, to do that work, because there's been no incentive to. I don't know. The only place that I've seen it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is either people that all of a sudden have these transformative learning experiences because they've had patient teachers, or you're imposing upon probably somebody who's been marginalized and oppressed, and they finally go, oh my God, listen, you're doing this thing again, will you please stop? And you go, oh my God. And then you have, or they seek out therapy. And that's the other place that I've gone. I've been reading a lot of Carl Gustav Jung and reading Jungian therapy to help me to do this work. I don't know that there are many other places where it's incentivized. Like I don't see it, and maybe I'm just not. So I think we need to build those spaces where people
Yeah,
have the opportunity.
I've seen some people arriving at this when what used to work doesn't work anymore,
Mm-hmm.
too, right? So people get overwhelmed with like the usual solutions don't. And then they realize that generally we overestimate the problems, we underestimate the solutions and what enthusiasm can do, and we miscalculate the gap between where we are and where we think we are, or where we would like to be, or our organizations would like to be. So we misjudge a lot of things, and we think it's much easier than it actually is. And I think this kind of work can actually help recalibrate
Mm-hmm.
this evaluations and
Mm-hmm.
help things move in a different way. But the problem is that generally, because it's very difficult to get people from I'm excited with these formulas and solutions into the depth of it, because it's
Mm-hmm.
like putting them in the wrong end of the pool, right? The deep end
Yeah.
of the pool. But people who are already in the deep end of the pool, they think it's oxygen. Like, give me the
Yes.
oxygen tank. This is the oxygen tank. Thank you. And now I can take it from here. But those at the shallow end of the pool, they do not appreciate it. And
No.
it's hard, because then the problem is that you then tend to shoot the messenger,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
negotiating all of this, and then there's a lot of people who think they want it but they're not ready. So to negotiate what the kind of stamina that you will need, the kind of relationship with the coach that you will need, is something that we're probably still learning. But these experiments are important, I think, maybe for that,
Mm-hmm.
for us to learn
Yeah.
what works, what doesn't work, what needs to be recalibrated, for whom this is, how many people we need to be able to move in this
Yes.
way. And I'm really grateful that you actually accepted to participate in it.
Oh.
And I would like to thank you for that, for co-hosting it
Oh.
with me.
Oh,
And
it's been an honor.
let's
Yeah.
keep doing it. Let's find other experiments that we can do together.
Yeah. Exactly. This is the work. This is the most difficult and I think the most important work that I can see right now. You want to talk about complexity. You want to talk about sort of thinking about the complexity of the systems out there, our linked social and ecological systems. We have to think about the complexity in here and amongst all of us. And this work of that depth work, I think it's another sort of, and I love to use the notion of a frontier, especially sort of reference to colonization, but this is the frontier, I think, in complexity. And I think if we're talking about systems change uh, and innovation, transformation, this work, this depth work, that is the challenge. This is going to be the work, the next sort of wave of work in innovation. I think it's got to be, and I thank you for your leadership in this regard, and I thank you for your patient mentorship. That I know I'm not the only one that appreciates this work. It is so important. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be involved. It's been really humbling. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.